The Second Crusade has failed, but its end will open the door to the Plantagenets, that brilliant, avaricious, rebellious, murderous family that will dominate the history of Western Europe for a century to come. Here's their story, so riveting that we still are fascinated by it 900 years later.
Welcome back to Lion's Forge. My name is Becket, and I want to tell you a story. An epic, true story of 5 kings and the Lion Queen. Season 2, Episode 16, The Luck of Princes. The Great Rebellion cracked open after Henry Plantagenet paid his first visit to the shrine of the martyred Archbishop Thomas Becket. Shortly thereafter, under the cover of thick fog, the King of the Scots, whose men were happily rampaging across the English countryside, was lounging at his ease in camp with only a few soldiers on watch. The fog suddenly thinned, and a company of English soldiers stumbled over the Scottish campfires. No one could have called this Scottish lion, William I, faint-hearted. The legend is that he grabbed his sword and his horse and rode straight into the English line, screaming his head off, a dramatic bit of personal daring-do that predictably ended with his capture. William's fall marked the beginning of the end of the revolt. It may have taken Henry a while to learn of it. He absolutely forbade being disturbed at night, and even after a messenger had ridden for some 72 exhausting hours with news of the victory, a zealous chamberlain refused to let him in because the king had already gone to bed. Meanwhile, the Lion of the Scots was brought from prison on horseback without stirrups for more than 50 miles. The man spent at least 2 days riding in this most uncomfortable and undignified way, kept in the saddle thanks to steel spring thighs, pride, and stoic resignation to God's will. The unlucky Scottish king had worse news coming, as many of his vassals in the border territories now thought better where their allegiance might lie and went to kneel at Henry's feet. The Scottish disaster also made its way across the Channel with unaccustomed speed. Young Henry hastily called off his planned invasion of England. Louis Capet, besieging Rouen, was beaten back when Henry Plantagenet came pelting down the road with his Flemish mercenaries and 1,000 crazy Welshmen. Even 16-year-old Prince Richard, on his way to becoming the greatest soldier of his generation, ended his part in the war by throwing himself on his father's love and mercy after losing a string of Aquitanian castles and being bottled up in the great fortress of Telburg. Other, lesser men, who had once been eager to fight, began to surrender, tensely riding to Henry's court at Northampton to ask forgiveness, to pledge newfound loyalty, and to turn property over to the victorious crown as a fine for their treason. By late September, Louis Capet, young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey met Henry near Tours to work out the end of the whole thing. It must have been a sight worth watching as haughty young Henry prostrated himself on the ground at my feet, tearfully asking me to accept his homage and fealty, according to an account dictated by his forgiving father. As penitence, young Henry agreed to give up John's castles. Richard also begged forgiveness. Henry, in turn, was so glad of the end of this ugly war that he increased the prince's annual allowances. A few years later, the extra pocket money would allow young Henry to swagger into the tournament of Lagny-sur-Marne, with a retinue of knights that reportedly cost him the incredible sum of 200 gold coins a day. Indeed, Henry must have been feeling unusually pleased with himself. His second illegitimate son, the eventual William Longspre, would soon be snug in the womb of Lady Ida de Tosny. And we do have to insert a footnote here, just because it's truly riveting. William Longspre, or Longsword, was long thought to be the son of Henry and his mistress Rosamund Clifford, but that romantic theory was debunked years ago. His far more probable mother, the Lady Ida, was a member of the de Tosny family, originally Norman barons who came to England with William the Conqueror. Ida would go on to become a countess, marrying into the Becket tribe. Unlike many noble bastards who tended to join the church, Longspee eventually married. His wife was a great heiress hand-picked by the Plantagenets, which made him the exceptionally wealthy Earl of Salisbury. Nor did his story end with his death, as most do. 5 centuries after he died, his tomb was opened by curious descendants. A well-preserved rat was found curled inside the cavity of his skull. The rat had eaten quite a bit of arsenic, in line with an ancient rumor that Longspee had been poisoned. As for the final days of the Great Rebellion, amnesty was eventually granted to virtually everyone who had taken part in the uprising. Rebel castles were surrendered to the king or torn down, the stubs of their former walls dotting many of the hilltops in Henry's kingdom. Rebel lords, including Henry's legitimate sons, the princes, were taxed to pay the costs of the war. But no one lost his head, and no one was forced into exile. New treaties would be signed with the French, each side solemnly promising yet again never, ever to disturb each other's peaceful enjoyment of his realm. Even William the Scottish Lion and the Earl of Leicester, whose men had been massacred in the swamps of Fornham St. Genevieve, walked away. William won his freedom at the cost of some personal humiliation, publicly swearing as he signed the Treaty of Falaise that he and future kings of Scotland would be liegemen of the English crown. Leicester and his countess regained their lands and their titles after a few years in prison. Of course, no such mercy would be shown to the 3,000 Flemish mercenaries rotting in the ditches of Fornham, but such were the stark realities of medieval soldiering. The only aristocrat involved in the rebellion who didn't share in the king's benevolence was the woman he had once sworn to love and honor with his very life. There is a report in the chronicles that when war first broke into the open, Eleanor, disguised as a man, was captured, trying to make her way to her former husband's court in Paris. Without trial, without any public statement as to her whereabouts for more than a year, Eleanor would pay dearly. Henry Plantagenet ignored pointed suggestions that he divorce the great heiress, but he was not above imprisoning her for her supposed role in the Great Revolt. When the gates first closed on her, she was 50 years old. She would not be free for 15 years. So, Henry Plantagenet, King of England, Duke of Normandy and the Aquitaine, Count of Anjou, had won yet again. One of the luckiest men ever to sit on an English throne was the unchallenged master of England, Ireland, Wales, Brittany, and half of France. Men owed him allegiance from Scotland to Toulouse. He leaned in towards Spain. He was so wealthy that he could simply buy the desirable county of La Marche when its count wanted to head to the Holy Land. The province was a strategic gem of the eastern Aquitaine that traditionally had maintained independence from both the Plantagenets and the French, and its possession by Henry changed the area's entire power structure. If Louis Capet had ever been a rival, the outcome of the Great Revolt had settled that matter once and for all. Louis observed, with what degree of envy is hard to assess, that Henry, said Louis, lacks nothing and possesses all things, men, horses, gold and silk, gems and fruits and wild game. We have to note that he added, with what might well be considered a sly slap at his rival, "We in France have nothing except bread and wine, and happiness." Another Frenchman described Henry as le plus puissant souverain de l'Europe. There was little point to more war between the Capets and the plus puissant Plantagenet, and Louis would write a remarkable public statement that all, quote, should know that we have taken into our protection all the lands of Henri, King of England, our most dear brother, situated on this side of the sea, and in the event of his crossing over to England or undertaking a journey, we shall render help for the defense and protection of those lands. The King of France, to all intent and purpose, had become a liege of the King of England, rather than the other way around. Other kings sought the favor of Henry's prestige. Chroniclers reported that envoys came from Constantinople, from Germany, from Sicily and Flanders. His public abasement at Canterbury, combined with a pledge to finance 200 Knights Templar in the Holy Land, had reconciled him with the Pope. His government was set upon a renewed course of thoughtful improvements, just now implementing a new method for trying legal cases, with royal judges riding circuits around the country and lay juries hearing evidence. And his kingdom had largely been brought to heel. Nobles who had so recently made war against him had publicly and definitively dressed down. They hadn't lost their heads, but they had lost their castles. As historian W.L. Warren says, a castle was a symbol of authority. Its ruin was eloquent testimony to the folly of rebellion against Henry II. Even a generation later, reminders of the Great War were to be seen in ruined castles throughout England, Normandy, and Anjou. A great many walls, fences, and stockades must have been built from the stone shed by tumbling fortifications, while a great many moats slowly reverted to grass. Even more pointedly, Henry took charge of loyalist castles as well, squelching any ambitions among his own barons. There would be only one great lord in this world. Except for Richard, continuously honing his military skills in the Aquitaine, Henry's family relaxed, at least for a while, into a calm not commonly seen among adult Plantagenets. Granted, his queen wife was living a rather restrained life under guard, but his children were flourishing, including his daughters. Matilda was quite happily married to her Saxon prince, while ambassadors representing Alfonso of Castile and William of Sicily came courting, Alfonso wooing 8-year-old Eleanor, William intent upon Joan, 12. The girls' marriages would extend Henry's influence all the way to the Mediterranean. Manuel Comnenus of Byzantium, whom we haven't seen in a while, wrote to what he called his most dear friend, Henry, for help against the Turks, while the Holy Roman Emperor wanted Henry's support in his fight to gain control of Italy. The only clouds in Henry's sun-kissed sky were untimely deaths. Lovely Rosamund Clifford was gone, still in her 20s. There are stories that Henry paid for a shrine of silken hangings above her tomb, where candles burned by day and by night. He never would entirely get over her, his rose of the world, and no other mistress would take her constant place in his life. And while his daughter Matilda presented baby after baby to the Lion of Saxony, young Henry struggled. No one could know it then, but his little boy, his heir, born after pathetic effort and dead of exhaustion 3 days later, was to be his only child. Eleanor alone was given no leniency among all the participants of the Great Revolt. Perhaps she was the hostage who ensured Richard's good behavior. Perhaps she was still too alarmingly powerful to have free rein ever again. Perhaps Henry simply decided to make an example of the startling woman who was his wife. Eleanor would not be freed until Henry was dead, and Henry would not die for a long while yet. She probably guessed that that was the way it would be. She lived as a royal prisoner would, in various castles as 15 years slowly wore away. Confinement is very hard. Confinement of unknown duration, possibly for the rest of your life, had to be unimaginably hard, even if you were made of very stern stuff. She had firewood, food, clothing, candles, books, linen, dogs, her ladies, servants, and those visitors duly vetted by the royal officer who was her keeper, a gentleman named Ranulph de Glanville. She saw her sons, she saw her daughter Matilda. She had opportunities to walk, ride, read, write, embroider, hear mass, dine. But it had to be water dripping on stone, one day following the last virtually unchanged, another just like it due to dawn tomorrow. 15 years is a long time to look at the same trees, the same walls, the same arc of sky. If it had been a good year for Henry, one which left him feeling magnanimous, he would invite her to his Christmas court, an event which peeled a few weeks free from the dull routine of her life. There are some records that show her traveling with Henry for a year or so in the mid-1180s. Otherwise, he left her to contemplate the wrong she had done him. She must have heard news of her busy husband and busy sons. Rosamond was dead, true enough, but the newest scandal was that Henry had taken his son Richard's fiancée, Princess Alice of France, as a replacement. The French royal princess was now well into her teens, not to mention rounding off an entire decade as the unmarried fiancée of the English prince. Princess Marguerite had been married to young Henry when she was 2 years old. The church smelled scandal, while the streets winked and whispered. Now for his part, Henry, now 42, settled into largely peaceful pursuits for once in his life, governing his lands, reading his books, hunting his stags, and racing his falcons, while keeping an eye cocked on the eternal task of stamping out perpetual rebellion to his south. The bloody reality of the latter was largely left to his warrior son Richard, on his way to becoming the best military commander of his time. Henry had come to prefer a quieter life, rather like the wealthy uncle of a very large, if periodically unstable family, happy to spend time on such things as reconciling a fight between feuding neighbors, the King of Aragon and the Count of Toulouse, after which he held a festival at his court at Beaucaire. It was said, grandly, if improbably, that 10,000 knights attended, each naturally bringing his own retainers. Great councils of nobles would be called, often at Northampton, where his life had taken such a turn years before. Much time was spent refining his tax and judicial systems, not to mention swapping out royal ministers who were proving unsatisfactory for one reason or another. He continued to live at a breakneck pace, given that his method of governing depended heavily on his personal observations, his personal web of appointed officials. There are often quoted letters about Henry, written just about this time by his secretary, Peter of Blois, in which Peter good-naturedly complains to friends, "If the king says he'll remain in place for a day, he is sure to upset all the arrangements by departing early in the morning. If, on the other hand, the king orders an early start, he is sure to change his mind, and you can take it for granted that he'll sleep until midday. Many a time a message would be sent from his chamber to ready all to visit a place, but after the courtiers had gone ahead almost a whole day's ride, the king would turn aside to see some other place. You see men dashing around as if they were mad. I hardly dare say it, but I believe in truth that he took delight in seeing the fix he put us in. He never lingers in his palaces like other kings, but goes about everywhere inquiring into everyone's doings." Henry held to no more of a fixed course in terms of his fatherly affections, possibly because his older sons had proven something of a trial and a sorrow, the king turned toward his first bastard, Geoffrey the bishop, and also toward his youngest legitimate child, little Prince John, now 8. The former would be one of Henry's closest advisors for the rest of his life, raised to the heights of Chancellor of England. As for John, Henry's first clumsy attempt to create some kind of inheritance for his little boy had been kindling for the Great Revolt. The young prince now had 3 castles, Chinon, Loudun, and Mirbeau, turned over by his oldest brother after a great many lives had been sacrificed in the argument over which young lord got to keep them. To cap off the awful irony of that entire mess, the little bride-to-be, Alice of Maurienne, whose father's ambitions had pressed the issue of John's future, had died within a year of her betrothal. The Maurienne family evidently was going to suffer for the war it had innocently sired. Henry didn't bother to pursue the normal discussion that would have matter-of-factly replaced the dead girl with a sister. Instead, a substitute bride came from a great English family, the Fitzroberts, Earls of Gloucester, an illegitimate line descended from Henry Beauclerk. The first Earl, Robert Fitzrobert, had been the oldest of Beauclerk's many bastards, making him Empress Matilda's half-brother and her most valued ally during the anarchy. While the Gloucesters' loyalty had been less evident during the Great Revolt, they again apparently enjoyed Henry Plantagenet's favor. Gloucester lands, hard on the Welsh border, provided enough wool, leather, forged iron, and dried fish to make the earls very wealthy men, prideful, powerful, entirely collected at the idea of standing beside a king. After all, they were cousins of the Plantagenets, even if cousins born, as one might say, on the wrong side of the counterpane. The current Earl, William, had only daughters. Entirely contrary to the way things were supposed to be done, the elder girls were openly disinherited thanks to Henry's vigorous intervention, so that the youngest, named Isabel, became heiress to a huge swath of her father's holdings in exchange for her betrothal to Prince John. We don't know why she was chosen, except that she was close in age to 10-year-old John. The two would not actually marry for another dozen years. Prince John, in turn, was about to ensure there would be no more objections to his lack of property. Entirely thanks to his father, he was about to take control of all of Ireland. Ireland was an interesting possession, one that could be taken as both an echo of Eleanor and Henry's one-time passion, and a sobering story about the national consequences of overheated sexual chemistry. The chronicler Gerald of Wales, admittedly not the most reliable journalist of his day, wrote that the whole story of the English in Ireland began when an Irish prince left his wife behind while he went adventuring. The lady apparently took advantage of her husband's absence by allowing herself to be beguiled, and it seems more than merely beguiled, by a rival lord named Dermot MacMurrough. The result was a war among the Irish chieftains, unpleasant but expected since, as Gerald blandly observed, almost all the greatest evils in the world have arisen from women. MacMurrough, who was losing at war if not at love, ultimately went to Henry for help, which took the form of permission for MacMurrough to recruit willing volunteers from among the Plantagenet barons. A down-on-his-luck aristocrat named Richard de Clare, nicknamed Strongbow, read the letter with interest. De Clare had problems stemming from Henry's old grudge over de Clare backing King Stephen during the anarchy. Ireland would give him a fresh start. He led a small army onto the Irish coast, beat back MacMurrough's enemies, married Mac MacMurrough's daughter, and was named the heir to Mac MacMurrough's kingdom. Over the next several years, he'd go on to defeat an Irish army under Rory O'Connor, powerful king of the West Country, setting the Norman English firmly at the summit of the ruling aristocracy of Ireland. Henry hadn't paid all the much attention to the island, too busy with his other holdings. But once the awful spectacle of December 29, 1170 was splashed across the cathedral floor at Canterbury, Henry wanted an escape from the horrified scrutiny of the civilized world. It so happened that just about then, Strongbow was settling rather too comfortably into the role of master of the island. Accordingly, early in 1171, a few months after Becket's death, Henry brought his own army to the Irish coast and marched to Dublin, ultimately declaring himself Lord of Ireland. The move, bolstered as it was by papal approval, was generally accepted quietly, making Henry's only visit to the country less dramatic than his norm. Indeed, little happened there from Henry's perspective for some years. By 1177, half a decade after Henry's intervention, Strongbow had died. The local power vacuum left in Strongbow's wake proved useful as Henry cast about for a suitable boon to mark young John's allegiance with the powerful Fitzrobert family. Making the boy the ruler of Ireland seemed to fit. John, Ireland's new ruler, was 11 years old. We've come to the end of our story for the time being. I am Becket Arnold, narrating from the book Lion's Forge, adapted for us by the author Karen Markle-Knabb. Thank you to Francis Butt for voicing our introduction. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating, follow our channel, and share us with your friends. Most importantly, please join us again July 8th for the next episode of Lion's Forge, available everywhere you get your favorite podcasts, including on YouTube with video episode trailers. Visit us on Facebook, where you can ask questions, leave reviews, and interact with me. Until next time, thank you for listening.